Okay, so where I left off my story last time was at the end of Thanksgiving of 2007, where I was almost certain that I was going to be fired from my preaching intern job, and I wasn't. But it was at that time that I decided two things. One was that I wasn't being treated like a preaching intern. I was instead being treated as the second preacher. And so that's how I would see myself. The second thing that I decided was to spend my energies toward the teenagers of the congregation that I was at, and not just the teenagers at my congregation, but also at some of the surrounding congregations of the area. There were a couple reasons for that. One was that I saw myself in them. If you remember, I think it was all the way back in the first part of this series, I kind of talked about my background. And I went through a portion of my life where I abandoned my faith, even though I grew up in the church and I eventually came back around to it. And subsequently, kind of like thinking about that time in my life, I didn't have a lot of people who were slightly older than me to kind of guide me through those teenage years and those doubts, especially when you start facing them when you get into college. And so I wanted to be for those kids what I wish I had when I was like 16, 17 years old, to help me think and about certain things and frame them in certain ways, to give me like some tools to understand what to do when doubts arise or people bring up various objections to things. So that was in part that. And the other thing was that Wichita is not a place where single people in their 20s typically stay. If Wichita is one of those cities where after you graduate high school, you leave. It's not the place where young people, especially young people who are unattached, stay. It's only after they're married and they have a couple kids that they start to think about, oh, I had a good childhood growing up in Wichita. I think I'll go back. So, so young families will go to Wichita, but so there wasn't a lot of people in my age bracket in the young 20s or just in their 20s and single that were there to fill that spot. And so I saw myself as a potential bridge between the teenagers of the church and adults, and to be kind of this example that like you can be a part of the church after you leave your parents' home and you start your own life. And that was kind of the idea, that why I wanted to do that. So I want to talk a little bit about what I specifically did. Like sometimes when I talked about what I did with the teenagers, I would jokingly say that I was the de facto youth minister, and to kind of describe what I was doing. So I never grew up with a youth minister or anybody like that, or anybody that focused their time and energies toward the youth. And so my understanding of what a youth minister is or what a youth minister does is kind of guided by what people who have been in churches and denominations that have those things and what their various experiences with that were. One of the things that I've kind of gotten, and maybe this is just a stereotypical kind of thing, is that youth ministers sometimes turn out to be these kind of glorified babysitters. They go out on trips and they take the teenagers out to do fun things, and there's not really a lot of religious instruction or counseling or other things that go on. And I'm sure that mileage varies between youth minister to youth minister. But while I wanted things to be fun for these kids. I also wanted to. I was also very cognizant of my limited time. I only had 6 months left, and I wanted to do as much as I possibly could for them with the time that I had. And so I set up these Friday night studies, and there would be time to, they came and we usually had like pizza or something along those lines. And that's always good for teenagers to have pizza. And, and we would eat, and then we would have a study. And I guess I'll call it a Bible study, but maybe it's not any kind of Bible study that you've been to. And then after we did that for maybe 30, 40 minutes. And then after that, the kids were free to play games. Sometimes we watched movies. Sometimes we did all sorts of other things. It was a good hangout time as well. So I don't want to say like this was all just instruction, but the main point was the instruction. And so the way that I did my Bible studies most of the time, I took strips of paper and I wrote a scenario on each strip of paper. And the scenarios were basically things that either I had experienced in high school or college that were kind of ethical dilemmas or questions that come up about the Bible that in a real world setting, or things, if they didn't happen to me, things that I could have reasonably understood had happened to me, or things that I had heard somebody else deal with. And so just kind of an example of some of the kinds of scenarios that I present were things like a friend of yours comes up to you privately and tells you that she's pregnant and she's thinking about getting an abortion. What do you tell her? Or a friend of yours confides that he's been thinking about committing suicide. What do you tell him? What do you do? Sometimes they weren't as depressing or heavy as those. Some of them were just about religious differences. You have an opportunity to talk to a friend who is this denomination, or you have an opportunity to talk to a Muslim, or you have a friend that says that they believe in the Bible, but they don't think going to church is important, or just all sorts of various things. And so I would write these on strips of paper and I'd fold them up and I'd put them all in a hat. So what I would have one of the kids do is pull out one of these scenarios at random, and then we would talk about it. But there were a few rules around the talking about it. So it was okay to talk about whatever you thought about the particular scenario. But the rule essentially was, I need you to back up that opinion with some kind of biblical backing. And it couldn't be something like, well, I know that it's somewhere there in the Bible. Like you had to go and find the verse that you wanted to talk about or that you were thinking about, and then tell me how that verse applies to this particular kind of situation. And so there were several reasons why I did it that way. One was to help these teenagers bridge between this ancient book called the Bible and see it having application in their lives today. So, and then understanding how to take these ancient texts and understand them in a modern context, and how to interpret them. And then not only just how to interpret them, but then how to live it out. And we'd talk about those kinds of various things. And this was the age. This was before every teenager had a smartphone, so they had their Bibles, and I would bring in some concordances. And if you don't know what a concordance is, it's an obsolete book now because you can just do searches for various words. But a concordance would list every word that appears in the Bible in a various translation, and then it would give you each verse that that particular word appeared in. So a concordance was a very useful tool if, like, you can kind of remember the verse that you're looking for, and you remember a few of the words in the verse, but you can't quite remember where it was. You could look up, one of the key words, and then find the verse that you were looking for. So that was kind of what we used it for. And so I would bring in like 2 or 3 concordances, and it was there for those kids if they could think of a verse, but they couldn't quite remember where it was. It was there for them to find that verse, and then be able to continue the discussion. And so that was also another part of this, was to show these kids, most of whom had grown up in the church themselves for their entire lives, that they knew more of the Bible than they thought they knew. And that all those years of being in Sunday school and sitting listening to sermons because their parents dragged them to church every Sunday and every Wednesday, that they had gained a lot more knowledge than they actually knew that they had, and that they had the ability to apply that. And then the other thing was, to my job, not only was as facilitator, so if they didn't have an idea of where to go, I would have some things like I would give leading questions or something to kind of prod or lead them along. But if things got a little too easy for them, I would also play devil's advocate and introduce some kinds of wrenches into their perfect answer. So, like, and just for example, like with the abortion question, like perhaps you can come to a very easy understanding that abortion is wrong according to the Bible, but there's a bigger question within the scenario of what do you do? What do you do when somebody confides in you that that's what they're thinking about doing? Like, there's one thing to just say, oh, well, the Bible says it's wrong, so you just tell them that they're wrong, but that's not very compassionate. That's not very kind. What if they don't believe in the Bible? What is something that you do in that case? And so that's the kind of like kinds of ways that I would direct and talk about these various issues. So I think that, at least for me, I think that the kids got a lot out of it. And also, I'm going to say, I want to say that that this idea for this kind of Bible study didn't originate with me. It actually originated with my father. When I was living in St. Louis, and I was in 9th and 10th grade. I don't want to get into a long discussion about this, but my dad did something similar with some of the other teenagers because he saw that there was not a very good Bible class structure for the older teenagers at the church that we were attending. And so he did something very similar to that. And so that was the best Bible class that I had ever had when I was a teenager, where we were actually just talking about real life scenarios, talking about how to apply the Bible to those, and the various kinds of questions and things that come up along with that. And so that was by far the best Bible class that I had ever had when I was a teenager. And so I just kind of adapted that and did that myself for those kids. And that seemed to go off pretty well. And the kids would come back week after week, and they seemed to have a fun time just picking out random suggestions and talking about it. And that also kept me on my toes, because at any moment I could be talking about one of 10 different potential scenarios. So I had to be prepared for talking about any of those kinds of things. And so it was a lot of fun all around, but I think it was also very profitable, or I hope so, for those kids. And in doing that, I think a lot of the parents of those kids were very grateful that these classes and these gatherings were going on. And I think they were making it known to the elders of the church and to Bob that they really appreciated me doing that. And I don't know if they thought that that was something that the elders or that Bob suggested that I do. I don't know if they knew that that was something that I took of my own initiative, and that it was not from any elder or Bob input. But regardless, the word got around that they were very appreciative of what I was doing. And so Bob, even though he was very critical of me at various ways throughout the first 6 months, he stopped being so critical, at least to my face. He stopped demanding that I make cold calls or go door knocking. And it seemed like he kind of begrudgingly accepted that what I was doing with the teenagers was a good and profitable thing to be doing. So, like I said, I only had 6 months left in Wichita, and so I had to start thinking about where I was going next. And my thought was that I was going to become a preacher somewhere else. Like I was just going to find another congregation in another part of the country or somewhere else in the world, and preach there. And so, around February or so, I started applying to various churches that were looking for preachers. I even went out to a couple of places, including a church out in Nevada, and kind of preached and tried out there. And in the process of that, we had a guest preacher come and give a week-long series of sermons, and I'm going to call him Daniel. And Daniel came from the Houston, Texas area, and he was a fairly young guy. I guess at the time he was probably in his early to mid 30s. He was a very good preacher, and he was one of those kinds of preachers, the 3-point sermon preacher. Very, every sermon was 3 points, and it's not to say that that was a bad thing. Like he knew his thing, and he did it well, and he was very good at it. His sermons were top notch, and he was a very good speaker, and he was very personable, and the people at this congregation in Wichita really liked him, and I got to spend some time with him, and it was really good. So Daniel came and did a week-long series of lessons, and at the end of the week, he asked me a question while we were together. And actually, I think he may have called me. I don't think we had this conversation face to face, but it was like Friday evening or Saturday morning or something like that. He was going to leave, and he called me, and he asked me. And he had been talking to other people, and he had found out about these teenage studies that I've been doing and all the things that I've been doing, and people have been talking to him about me, among other things. And when he called me, he asked me, if money wasn't an issue, if you could stay in Wichita and preach and teach these kids for another half a year through the end of the year, if you could do that, would you? And as far as I know, as far as I remember, I didn't even hesitate to think about it. I said yes, in part because I felt like 6 months wasn't enough to accomplish what I wanted to do. Like I really, 6 months was barely anything to spend with these kids. And another 6 months would have done them a lot more. Like I could have done a lot more for them. And so that was my thought. And so I said yes. And so he told me, well, he had been talking to Bob. Bob had taken him to the airport, and they were talking on the way to the airport. And he floated this idea to Bob, and he said, well, what if my congregation pays for the support for Eric through the end of 2008. So it wouldn't be a cost to the congregation that I was at, and this other congregation in Houston would support me for the remaining 7 months of 2008. And Bob had agreed to that. And when I heard that Bob had agreed to that or thought that that would be a good idea, it kind of surprised me. But I thought, oh, well, maybe because of this other stuff, he stopped complaining about various things. And so I thought like maybe he had warmed up to me. Maybe he thought I was doing pretty good. But Daniel told me that he had preliminarily talked to the elders about it and that it wasn't finalized, but he was pretty sure that he could get that arranged and that I could stay around in Wichita and continue working through the end of 2008. So I took that. And so my year-long internship turned into a year and a half, but the last half was going to be paid by this congregation from Houston was going to cover, and they were going to end up paying less per month than what I was being paid before, but that was fine. It wasn't my intention wasn't to make money or anything. I wasn't making any money at all anyway. I was making a very small bare minimum kind of amount, but that was fine. My intention was to do as much good for these teenagers as I could in the time that I had, and I was just given 7 more months, so I thought that that was fantastic. So I got that news from Daniel, and then maybe about a week later or sometime during the next week, I had a Bible study where Bob was there and his wife was there and maybe and a few other people. I can't remember exactly who else was there. We had various kinds of Bible studies, but sometimes Bob would set up these Bible studies to be kind of early morning, like maybe 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning, so that after that we could go to lunch and so I like I can remember like these some of these details like so vividly. So after this one Bible study that we had, we went to this Chinese restaurant that was down the road from the church building, and it was this Chinese buffet kind of. It was this kind of cheap Chinese buffet that Bob really liked, and so we went there. And so I was there with Bob and his wife and with the people that we were having this Bible study with. And there was this point in time where it was just me and Bob at the table, and all the other people that were with us were there, at the buffet line or something else like that. And Bob took that opportunity while it was just me and him to tell me why he had told Daniel that he thought that I should stay around for another 7 months. So he says, so he brings it up in kind of this way of like, so, about how the Daniel was talking with me about how he was going to offer another 7 months and that he thought that it would be a really good for me. And I told him that I thought that would be a good thing. And I said something along the lines of like, well, I appreciate that. And then Bob says to me, you know why I said that, right? I don't remember what I said after that. And then he says, if I said anything at all. And then he says, I said that because you're not ready. You're not ready to preach on your own. You need at least another 6 months in order to be even competent. There were other people. Then he said, like, the other people that had gone through this internship kind of thing before you, they were ready in a year, but you're not, and you need more time. And so, like, he even took this positive thing, this thing that people in the congregation and even Daniel saw as a very positive thing, and he found a way to make it this this very negative thing, to bring me down, to put me down, and to put me in my place. At least that's what I think he thought he was doing. He was trying to make me feel like I was nothing and that I owed him everything. But it was like one of those things that I couldn't quite believe what I was hearing at the time. But it was I don't know. I thought it was kind of I don't know what to think of that. I still don't know what to think of that. Like, what was he trying to communicate? Like, was he trying to make me feel bad? Was he trying to make me feel like I don't know. Anyway, that kind of sets up for the next part. Um, so that brings us up to about halfway through the year 2008, and the next part gets a lot darker and a lot more awful than it has been so far. So I would say look forward to it, but I'm not. But it should be interesting, and I think it should be eye opening and helpful for other people who maybe have also had bad church experiences, not just preachers, but anybody who's had a bad church experience. I think that this next part will be eye opening and illuminating. So thanks for listening to me, and I hope that you'll stick around. And until we talk again, God bless you.